Compassion. Love that responds is an antidote for cruelty. It is never pity. And if the heart falls into sadness or grief, then joy balances the heart. So following our format here of talking about all of these different views of compassion, we begin with this focus that it's love that responds. Just take a moment and think about what that simple word means. Love that responds. And what it's responding to is suffering. The ancient language talks about how when we perceive suffering in another, it causes the heart to quiver. And we respond, committing to ameliorate, to address the suffering of others. The vow of the Bodhisattva, which is a being that has become fully enlightened but chooses to stay present, is that the Bodhisattva vows to ameliorate, relieve the suffering of all beings everywhere. A huge commitment. So it's love that responds to suffering. An antidote for cruelty. Cruelty is, in fact, wanting others to suffer. When we think about how people can engage in acts of cruelty, we see that it's deliberate causing of suffering. The near enemy of compassion, a human quality that masquerades as compassion, but actually draws us away from it, is pity. And the reason it's the near enemy is because pity is about us. It's not about the other and the other's suffering. It's about how we're affected by it. And to be avoided here is sentimentality. There's nothing sentimental required to respond to compassion, or to respond to suffering with compassion. And the results of engaging in compassion are that it connects us with humanity, and it removes our self-centeredness. Some years ago, I heard a great little story routine about how to explain compassion. And I'll share it with you this morning. So a man's walking down a street, and it's a contemporary story, so the man is absorbed with his smartphone. And this could only happen to a man. A woman would never do something as dumb as what this man's about to do. But the man's walking down the street, paying attention to his smartphone, and he walks into a construction zone that's not very well marked, and he falls in a hole. And the hole's deep enough so that he can't get out. So he's in the hole, and not long after, another person walks down the street and looks at him and laughs and says, "You dummy, how could you be so stupid as to fall in a hole? What's the matter with you?" And walks off, chuckling to himself. Another person comes along and looks at the man in the hole and says, "Oh my, this is awful," and runs away. Can't deal with it. Complete denial. The next person who comes along looks at it and looks at the man in the hole and says, "This is awful, how terrible," and jumps in the hole with him. Empathic distress, pity. The next person who comes along looks at the man in the hole and says, "Oh my, this is awful. I need to do something about it." And he goes away And a few minutes later, he comes back with a ladder and lowers the ladder down into the hole and encourages the man in the hole to climb up the ladder. And the story can go either way here. Either the man climbs up the ladder and everything turns out to be fine, or it turns out that there's some reason that the man cannot bring himself to climb up the ladder. And the person who got the ladder stands at the top, encouraging the person in the hole to climb out in every way imaginable. And eventually, the person doesn't climb out. And so the man who brought the ladder walks away. So in thinking about these different ways of showing up after seeing a man in a hole, which are the ones that are skillful and which are the ones that are about me? What's important here in compassion, in being compassionate, in taking skillful action, in translating this fundamental empathy that we feel for another's suffering, is that we act in a way that does not take away agency of the other person who's suffering. Just think about what that means for a moment. It's about taking skillful action. It's about responding. It's about feeling the empathy and then doing something without compromising the other person, without taking away that other person's agency. So the focus is on the other. And we need to be discerning about what's called for. Think about the difference between jumping in the hole and going and getting the ladder. And sometimes, even less than going and getting the ladder is required. Actually, it may be more and more difficult. Sometimes what's required is simply to be present, to be in silence, to be listening, but to offer that human presence that allows the person who's suffering to feel, oh, I'm not alone in this. I have not been left behind. I'm not being ignored. I'm being tended to and cared for. So the key to compassion is that we feel the empathy in ourselves and then we move outward so that it's never about ourselves. And yet, paradoxically, we don't leave ourselves open to compassion fatigue because we care for ourselves. We take care of ourselves as we go along. And it's easy to fall into compassion fatigue. Circumstances put us in that place again and again. And that's what self-compassion is all about. And self-compassion is sufficiently different or sufficiently a separate topic that we will deal with that at another time. So today we'll just stick with compassion. So in those moments when we perceive another to be suffering and we hesitate, we get lost in not knowing what to do. We get lost in oh, I might do the wrong thing. What causes us to hesitate? This is a moment to look inside and say, what's going on inside me here? What fear is present? What's underlying this fear that's keeping me from responding to this suffering? When we are compassionate, we are more connected. We're not separate. We've moved past the vulnerability of feeling separate. And in this experience of connecting, there's self-affirmation. I read a couple days ago, if you're ever down and want to lift yourself up, go do something compassionate or kind for someone else. So let's take a moment and do a practice. And finding a comfortable place, comfortable way to be in the surface you're sitting on. And allowing yourself to come into presence. Taking a couple of deep breaths. Softening. Offering yourself a bit of kindness for being right here, right now. And directing your attention to your breathing. Feeling the breathing in your body. Where does breathing show up in your body? Where do you most notice it? And bringing to mind someone you care about. Choosing a specific person in your life whom you care about. Holding an image of that person right in front of you. And recalling a time when this person has struggled, faced difficulty, perhaps even suffered. Recalling the specifics of this person's struggle and suffering. What was going on? What was happening? Where was this person? Imagining this person's face in moments of struggling. Allowing your empathy to be touched, to engage. And in that circumstance, where this person you care about was struggling, how did you respond at that time? Lots of times, there's an urge to jump in and fix the situation. Or perhaps it was so upsetting to you that you fell into what's known as empathic distress. Perhaps there was some hesitation on your part feeling some vulnerability in potentially responding to this suffering. Or maybe there was simply some listening on your part. You stayed present and listened without commenting, without judging, without fixing. You allowed your empathy to help you form a deep understanding of what this person's experience was like in this moment. Maybe you began to think of various alternatives for responding. Finding enough space to be creative with those alternatives. Maybe you eventually took skillful action that helped alleviate the suffering without trying to fix. Taking a moment now and forming an intention about how you will respond when you see suffering in another. Whether it's someone close to you or someone you barely know. What intention do you hold for how you will show up, how you will respond in the face of suffering? And in closing, offering yourself a few words of kindness for engaging in a challenging experience.